So in this video, we're going to be talking about some of the stuff on the side over here, the channel box and the attribute editor in particular. And if you don't see those, just make sure that they're on over here up at the top. But just like how we've been creating objects and then moving them around and doing different things like scaling them, we can actually modify all of that stuff numerically in the channel box and the attribute editor rather than relying on our eyeballs, right? Rather than sort of abstractly moving this stuff, we can look over here and type in specific values. So I've just generated a cube just by simply clicking the polycube, and I'm going to tap F to frame on that. And over here on the right hand side, I can see in the channel box in the layer editor, I have my pcube1, and that's the name of my object. I can actually click and change that if I like, so I could call that like first cube or something like that. And then we have these three translation options, which you can guess what those are. Translation means movement, so those are our translation options. They all start at 0. And as we move, it's going to move the object around. So let's say I want to translate it 1 unit Z and 1 unit in Y, and it will move our object thusly. Rotations the same way. Scale, and then visibility just turns it on and off. Below that, we have a bunch of different options. You may not necessarily have all of these, just kind of depends. But we can ignore all of that stuff. And then we also have inputs down here. And inputs, where it says polycube1, this is the command that we fed Maya to generate this cube. And if I click and twirl that down, it gives me a bunch of different options that I can modify. And I'm going to go into what these options are in just a second, but just to explain how this works, Maya is a node-based editor, meaning that there's kind of like a lot of different factors being plugged into, different values being plugged into Maya, and then Maya sort of spits out these files. You can actually open up all of these Maya binaries and ASCII files that you generate and see that they're simply just text files mostly. And they just have a bunch of commands that are being sent to Maya and telling it how to make this. So it's telling it, all right, plot a point here, plot a point here, plot a point here, draw a line between them, fill this in with this color, and now that's a 3D object. So really, we're giving it, this input is the values that we gave it to start with. So as we change these, we're going to see the dynamics of our object shift and change over here. Whereas up top, these options are really just, these are just dynamic changing options that we're modifying at any time. So I'm going to show you an example. I'm going to click my inputs, and I'm going to click on subdivision width, and I'll type in the number 5 and just click off of it to accept that. What's happened is it's subdivided, meaning it's created extra edges and vertices on my object, specifically on the width of my object, and it's done it into 5 different little sections. So by default it's at 1, now it's added 5. So you can probably think about how this works. In our last video, we were modifying edges and things like that, but you could grab an edge and pull just that edge up or push just that edge down to start creating some more interesting shapes than just our simple face modifications that we were doing before. Also in here we have subdivision height, so I can put that at 5 and let's see what happens. So now it's added these 5 slices over here, which on certain faces creates this nice grid pattern which we could start playing with, creating something a little bit more organic than what we had before, creating something a little bit more interesting too. But what I want to say is that generally these inputs, we don't really want to modify these after the fact, after we've created our object. I'm going to show you how to modify these right whenever we start, right whenever we generate our cube. We can tell it as we're generating the cube, here's what I want, and then we can start modifying things. Now the reason that I don't want you to modify these after the fact, like I've just done, other than in this simple case or like right whenever you start modeling an object, is because if we get further down the line and I start changing properties, I could just show you this really quickly. If I start, let's say, messing with extrusions, which we'll get into in a little bit, and then I go back and I change that option, I start changing this like subdivision width to like 6 or like 8. It starts to really modify things in ways that I didn't really intend it to do. So keep that in mind. We don't really want to modify these options, this first input after the fact. after we start adding in more inputs, such as this extrusion command that I just did and other commands that we're going to do to our model. So I'm just going to delete my model, and rather than single clicking and generating the cube like that, I'm going to double click the cube. So I double click it, and what happens is it opens up my input options. So I have my width, my height, my depth, the divisions. So let's put this at 10 width divisions, 2 height divisions, 2 depth divisions, and I'll say create. And what's going to happen is it's going to make a model with those inputs over here already in place, properly made for me to then modify. So I have to do a little bit of planning, a little bit of sketching to start with, just to figure out, what all I need for my model. So I'm just going to do a little modification here, something kind of goofy. All right, great. So you get how that whole system works. We can also double click on other things. So for example, I'm just going to select this and delete this. My sphere, by default, has a lot of extra polygons and is probably a little unnecessarily large. If I double-click that, I can actually choose the radius, choose the axis and the height divisions. So I could have a really simple sphere like this, right? Much more geometric, almost like a disco ball. Or I could have a really complicated sphere that maybe pushes it up to, let's just go to the max, like this, where it's really smooth. The cylinder is a great case where the default cylinder, and your default cylinder probably looks a little different than mine. Mine's probably even modified over the years that I've been using this software, has different axis divisions. So if I wanted to make, something really smooth, I can create something really smooth. If I want to make something really simple or more geometric, I can do that. I can create, in fact, just like a little pyramid. So that's the inputs within the channel box that we're modifying. So let's make a cube. I'm just going to set that back to my normal 1x1 cube and hit create, and now I have my cube. So the attribute editor, we've talked about the channel box, and the channel box, like I said, this is going to grow as you give it more inputs. It's going to have multiple, so as we start doing extrusions and things like that, this is going to keep getting longer and longer and longer, and you can go back and edit these different nodes. That's what the channel box looks like. The attribute editor is a little bit different. This shows you the nodes in a slightly different way. This kind of shows you in a different tabbed view all of the things that are making up this object. And this gets very, very complicated, and we're only going to use this a few times in this class. But in this view, for example, if I go to the pCube1 tab, I see the transformation attributes, the pivots, all kinds of things. If I click on the next tab, the shape tab, I have other options. The polycube tab, well, this is my input that I originally fed it, right, to generate the cube. And I can change things here. We have the shading group, we have this Lambert, and then within each of these, I can click and go deeper and deeper and deeper. This can be absurdly complicated, so I really want to advise you to, for now, stay away from this attribute editor. Don't go in here and start playing with values and things, but be aware of it. Be aware that this attribute editor shows you all of these properties that you're modifying. So as I move my object, if I look at pCube1, that translation changes as I move it around. See that value? And we are going to be using this a little bit later, specifically to apply colors and shapes and things like that. So channel box is kind of a simplified view of that attribute editor. And within that channel box, we can change different values with numbers, and also we can change inputs as we start making them.